Hello, spooky friends. This is Kitty, and tonight we're talking about Dan Curtis. I'm going to name my top 5 Curtis productions as a blatant excuse to showcase one of the finest creators of horror of the 20th century. We'll be discussing decades-old media, so there will be spoilers. You have been warned. Most genre fans know Curtis from Dark Shadows, the Kolchak movies, or that nasty ankle biter. We'll discuss those for sure, but I hope also to introduce you to a few gems you may not know about. Dan started out as a salesman for NBC, selling what he called syndicated crap to local stations. He worked his way up over 8 years, then spent a couple years packaging shows. By then, he decided he could do better than what he'd seen. With the wary support of his wife Norma, Dan quit his job, and in 1962, on a very thin shoestring, Dan Curtis Productions was born. His first production was a passion project, something he cared deeply about. Golf. It was golf. Let us never speak of it again. In 1965, he pitched an idea for a gothic soap opera to ABC, which brings us to number 5 on my list. Dark Shadows was born of a dream Curtis had of a governess arriving by train to work at a spooky mansion. It was originally intended to be classically gothic, mysterious, but with no supernatural elements. I read some gothic mysteries as a kid. I judged those covers with high hopes, only to be disappointed in the lack of actual ghosts. So, apparently, was the audience. After 10 months, it was on the chopping block. The story goes it was Curtis's daughters who saved Dark Shadows. They told Dad to make it scary. Thinking he had nothing to lose, he pulled out the stops, and the first ghost walked out of a painting at the old house. The audience was thrilled. The network was thrilled. I was thrilled, but probably for different reasons. Now I have a confession to make. I haven't watched all of Dark Shadows. In my defense, it's a lot. But that's not why it's number 5 on my list. It was a brilliant, groundbreaking show, but by its very nature, it was full of filler and stuttering actors flailing for a line. The filler was because it's hard to write enough material for 5 episodes a week, so you end up with things like people arguing about whether or not they want to have a conversation, and where they should have that conversation. Finally, to have a conversation. The bloopers, which are legendary, is because the show was filmed straight through with no second chances. Even though the show wasn't broadcast live, it was produced as if it were. Even Bob Cobert's wonderful music was played live, from 78s on the soundstage. Now, a side note about Bob Cobert. Cobert composed for Curtis on nearly every production. His Dark Shadows cues could be heard in many other projects, and he was especially good at sneaking in Quentin's theme, which was written for a Dark Shadows werewolf, even in the 1992 alien abduction movie Intruders. I swear, it's in the restaurant scene. Check it out. The actors had a few rehearsals, and that was it. Of course, they thought they were just filming an obscure soap that would be lost to time. But Curtis was a master of syndication from his years selling and packaging shows, so their performances lived forever. Sorry, guys. All the actors struggled with the lack of second takes. Honestly, the one who managed best was David Hennessy, who played David, who, as far as I've watched, has not yet been thrown off a cliff. His Phoenix mother tried to lure him into the flames once, but no dice. But seriously, other than being a child on a show I otherwise like, he did a great job. After 5 years and 1,225 episodes, Dark Shadows finally ran its course. Curtis, after using every monster story he could borrow, finally decided he was done creaking doors. As he became disenchanted with the project and eventually left, the show of course suffered. Barnabas retired to his coffin for the final time on April 2nd, 1971. Curtis tried to replace Dark Shadows with Dead of Night, A Darkness at Blaisdon, which shared music, sets, and even an actor from Dark Shadows. I thought the story of paranormal investigators was a great concept, but the pilot didn't take, and it ended up being a standalone movie. He also piloted the Norless tapes about a writer who disappeared, leaving several dozen carefully numbered tapes for his agent. It sounds like a plot for about a dozen podcasts. It never went anywhere, and it had more in common with another Curtis production than Dark Shadows, and we'll talk about that later. During and after Dark Shadows, Curtis produced 5 excellent adaptations of classic horror stories: Dracula, Frankenstein, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Turn of the Screw, and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Critically acclaimed to this day, they're amazing, and I recommend you check out every one. My favorite of the 5, and number 4 on this list, is Frankenstein. This adaptation was taped rather than filmed, and it has that soundstage feel, which is probably one reason it often gets overlooked. The Doctor is played by Robert Foxworth, and the Giant, as he's called here, is played by Bo Svensson, who I always thought played football before he got into acting, but no, he's just really big. In 1973, we had yet to see an articulate, intelligent monster, as was actually portrayed in the book. Svensson's Giant is a sympathetic and eventually tragic character. It has the usual second-act slowness that always gets to me, but by the end, I was reaching for the Kleenex. It really is an amazing adaptation. How many times have I said that? Well, it was amazing. It was an amazing adaptation. It's hard to choose between these 5 works, so I have to give honorable mention to Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde, both of whom were played by Jack Palance, who makes everything better. Also, I think it's important for you to know that the casting for Dracula was done by Bodie Boatwright Baker, who was clearly named by the internet. My number 3 is one you may not be familiar with. Scream of the Wolf has Peter Graves investigating a series of apparent werewolf attacks. He's on the case, I guess, because he used to be a big game hunter, and he's friends with the sheriff, and he just Jessica Fletchered his way in. I always had a soft spot for Peter Graves, but if I'm honest, Clint Walker steals the whole damn show with the psychopathic Byron. Byron is a big game hunter thoroughly poisoned by toxic masculinity. But, well, and this is one of Curtis's real strengths, his bad guys are interesting. Sure, Byron has wackadoodle philosophy, but it's coherent and well presented. You get it, even as you recoil from it. If you can find a good copy, it's worth a watch. Just beware of the VHS transfers, which is what most of the YouTube versions are. Early VHS producers, in their wisdom, thought everything should be in widescreen, even if it was made for television in the first place. So you end up with everyone stretched out from side to side, not to mention cutting off the top and bottom of the screen. I managed to get a DVD copy off eBay, and the quality is pretty good. I've uploaded it to my sister channel where I'll put this kind of thing. Link in the description. Okay, this is where I admit I couldn't actually narrow it down to 5 favorites, so we have a 3A, and that would be Amelia from Trilogy of Terror. First, let me clear something up. This is a Zuni fetish doll. This is not. Zuni? Not Zuni. I think they did this for 2 reasons. Okay, 3. 1, ignorance with a good old tinge of 70s racism. 2, very few people in their target audience were going to know the difference, and back then, you had to go all the way to the library to look things up. And 3rd, well, Zuni sounds cool. It's fun to say. Zuni. They tried to backtrack this in the second Trilogy of Terror by saying it wasn't Native American, it was African, and guys, no, that didn't help. The performance from our Holy Lady of Horror, Karen Black, is just a joy to watch. When she's on the phone with her mother, you can almost hear that nasty narcissist on the other end of the line. I suspect Black had not only her lines in her head, but an entire script for her mother as well. I found out when I was researching that Black did, in fact, rewrite this part of the scene. I admit this segment terrified me as a kid. I wonder if that's why I don't like puppets. As an adult, well, this had me laughing. I'm a terrible person who has seen too much. There is nothing like the final scene of Amelia. Karen Black, turning the knife in her hand between floor stabs. Genius. The penultimate entry on this list is Burnt Offerings, a haunted house movie based on the novel by Robert Marasco and adapted very faithfully by Curtis and his regular writer, William F. Nolan, except for the end. In the book, it's a little vague and artsy. Not so much in the film. Most of the movie is all slow burn and creeping dread, which is what makes the ending so shocking and effective. In a plot you'd think wouldn't work, but really does, this summer house rented by the unsuspecting Rolfe family is not haunted by some spooky entity. The house itself is the entity. Curtis brings back Her Holiness Karen Black to play Marion Rolfe, who is slowly engulfed by the house. Oliver Reed plays the dad with the vague, tragic backstory, and Lee Montgomery, who was excellent in the Dead of Night segment Bobby, plays the son. Bette Davis is superb as the cool aunt. Casting Davis was always a smart move. In the 70s, it was obligatory to see anything with her in it. It has to be good. It has Bette Davis. Curtis uses his usual low angles to give the action a sense of intimacy, pulling the audience inside as the Rolfe family slowly disintegrates. Luckily for us, we can actually leave the Allardyce home at the end. The real show stealer for me only appears a few times, briefly. It's the creepy, smiling chauffeur played by Anthony James. He incites the same freakiness as Julian Beck as the preacher in Poltergeist 2, except James wasn't dying of cancer at the time and went on to have a long, fruitful career, mostly playing creepy guys. The original story for the Night Stalker was called The Kolchak Papers, written by Jeff Rice, but heavily altered, I think for the better, by Richard Matheson. It became the highest-rated television movie of all time, a record it held for years. My family was right there with the rest of the country. I was itty-bitty, but I probably whined until I was allowed to watch. I started young, folks. The plot follows Carl Kolchak, masterfully played by Darren McGavin, intrepid reporter who stumbles into a fantastical story that even he finds hard to believe. In the end, of course, he's the only one who does believe. Or the only one who admits it. It's great, and yet this isn't my number one. That's right, I like the second movie better than the first. I think most of the reason for that is that the monster in The Night Stalker is a cardboard cutout of a vampire, a monster devoid of humanity and not up to Curtis's usual standard. I understand they needed to concentrate on the wonderful main character of Kolchak, but a little nibble, so to speak, of something from the vampire would have been nice. They give us that little nibble in The Night Strangler. In fact, they give us the whole wonderful history researched by Wally Cox's archivist. The movie gave me my motto.
Research. That's where the joy lies.
Yes, Wally, I'm with you. I may be swayed by the fact that I've actually been to the Seattle Underground. How I wished it looked like it does in the final scenes. Mostly it's just grubby basements, not the magical 19th century streets, frozen in time. I'm also swayed by the fact that they very nearly pronounce Puyallup correctly. In fact, close enough. Jeff Rice wrote Carl Kolchak as an amalgamation of himself and a reporter he knew at the Las Vegas Sun in the 60s named Alan Jarlson. I always thought that the acrimonious relationship between Kolchak and Vincenzo was way overdone, but it turns out that Vincenzo is directly modeled after the editor he knew at the Las Vegas Sun, and Alan Jarlson really did break that editor's window. My favorite scene in the movie is when Kolchak presents Vincenzo with actual, historical proof that the killer is an immortal monster. The grin on his face is adorable. He thinks everything is going so well, but we know better. Again, Curtis does his signature move of humanizing the bad guy, ably played by Richard Anderson, albeit said humanizing conversation is taking place amongst moldering corpses. There are gems in every minute of this film. It made me cheer, it made me laugh, and man, do I miss Darren McGavin. Burnt Offerings was meant to be Curtis's goodbye to horror, though he did hang on for Dead of Night and Curse of the Black Widow. After that, it was all family movies and war epics, of which he was rightly proud. He returned in the 90s for an unsuccessful revival of Dark Shadows, which I tried to watch, but the over-the-top Willie Loomis was too much for me. He also produced a second trilogy of terror, but honestly, it was pretty pale. Curtis left his mark on horror with smart villains, low angles, and endless renditions of Quentin's theme, and the genre was better for it. Well, maybe not the Quentin's theme. Special thanks to Jim Pearson, Jeff Thompson, Mark DeWitt-Jack, whose name I just butchered, and everyone who produced the excellent documentary Master of Dark Shadows. And thank you, spooky friends. I love you to death. Good night.